Alright, guys, so let's talk about US China relations today. It's now the US who's scrambling all the way to China. Of course, the elections are coming, and maintaining stable relations with Beijing is extremely important. Almost every country in the G7 is running there to build economic ties. And in the US case, they are desperate to prevent a breakdown that would just make the Harris camp look really, really bad. We have Jake Sullivan, the NSA advisor, making his journey to the east. And of course, he met with Wang Yi, the top diplomat from the Chinese side. Now, the grand idea, the grand plan is to manage tensions, but one has to wonder how to really reverse this rivalry. China's ambition is to rise up while the US has a clear policy of containment. Oil and water simply can't mix. They want to set up another Biden Xi meeting, but is the US president even lucid enough? It's going to be a big waste of time because America really loves to talk peace, but their actions are all about hindering China's economy. Even in the diplomatic scene, Sullivan loves to play divide and conquer. That is his narrative. This is his attempt to play India off Russia and China. Let's do a recap here.
Because Russia is getting closer and closer to China, and as the junior partner to China, is not necessarily going to be a great and reliable friend to India in a future contingency or crisis. That's not something India needs to hear from Jake Sullivan, but it is a fact in the world, and it's something that we take into account as we have our strategic dialogue with India.
So I find it hard to believe that Wang Yi will take this visit very seriously. If you look at the headlines, it's all about opening lines of communication, AI, and climate change. Now, I would argue those are just the excuses the site shows. America's true intentions with China should be very clear. It revolves around Taiwan, pushing down the Chinese economy, and trying to decouple them from Russia. But if we look at the South China Sea, the optics are looking really bad. China resents the fact that the US has a ton of bases and warships in the area, and the US Admiral just raised the stakes. The Navy is now open to escorting Philippine ships in resupply missions in the South China Sea. So we can immediately imagine how dangerous this can get. A supply run can immediately turn into a confrontation between the US and the Chinese Navy. Then we'll have big issues within the Indo-Pacific in addition to Ukraine and Israel. According to the US readout, it's the same old talking points once again, but this time Sullivan hammered Beijing on their economy, which is a very big sticking point. He confirmed that the US will continue to prevent advanced technologies from entering China, and that means more semiconductor chips restrictions. And he touched on the non-market economic practices as well, and that's a code word for Chinese government subsidies. So it is still containment 101, nothing has changed. So why is Sullivan busy in China? It's mainly because the US, no matter how mighty they might seem, they can't really afford three conflicts at once. They are bankrolling Ukraine, they are sending warships to back up Israel, and the last thing they need is the Indo-Pacific blowing up. During her campaign speech, Harris confirmed that the US will continue to support Ukraine till the very end. If she wins and Trump loses, fighting Russia won't end, it will only escalate.
Trump, on the other hand, threatened to abandon NATO. He encouraged Putin to invade our allies, said Russia could, quote, do whatever the hell they want. 5 days before Russia attacked Ukraine, I met with President Zelensky to warn him about Russia's plan to invade. I helped mobilize a global response, over 50 countries, to defend against Putin's aggression. And as president, I will stand strong with Ukraine and our NATO allies.
Sullivan is basically there to delay and tell the Chinese we have unfinished business elsewhere, especially with Russia, so can you all give us some breathing space? It's important we connect this to Ukraine's recent incursion into Russia. While it's true that Russia hasn't fired their nukes yet, you're kind of playing with fire here. You're giving Putin the ultimate excuse he was looking for. that the West can always move into Russia if NATO expands. The Kursk incursion only makes things worse. It's no coincidence that Lavrov has issued a World War III warning to the US. The mushroom clouds could really start appearing and that things are escalating really fast. And this next part is actually very frightening and tells us that a nuclear holocaust won't just be isolated to the continent. The West is playing with fire, and that American conversations around World War III assumes it will only affect Europe exclusively. Lavrov basically reminded the US that the world is at risk if missiles start flying. It could really trigger a deadly chain of retaliation. Now, we have no idea what went on behind the scenes during Sullivan's meeting in Beijing, but we can safely assume they are asking the Chinese to flip on Russia. Another point of consideration is the big disaster in the Middle East. Now, we all remember in 2023 when Sullivan declared the region is very safe, but it has flipped completely into chaos.
The war in Yemen is in its 19th month of truce. For now, the Iranian attacks against U.S. forces have stopped. Our presence in Iraq is stable. I emphasize for now because all of that can change. And the Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades.
I would argue that we've not seen a situation as dangerous as the one we're facing now across the region since at least 1973.
So the US is bogged down in two brutal conflicts. The only way to interpret Sullivan's trip to Beijing is really a last-ditch attempt. The agenda is to pacify the Chinese to get some time to wrap things up in their other two theaters of war. During the meeting, Wang Yi scolded the US for their strategic containment of the Chinese economy, and he narrowed it down to the issue of tariffs on EV exports. Using overcapacity as an excuse to engage in protectionism will only harm global green development and affect world economic growth. The US should not use its own path to speculate on China. So it's just a big waste of time. Nothing has fundamentally changed. You can have all the meetings in the world, all the back channels, but if the strategy of containment doesn't stop, if it continues, US-China relations won't really improve. But let's talk about the economic war against Russia. We have a big update and it's coming from the US Treasury. This time it's a warning to the world. The US threatens sanctions against any country that is hosting Russian banks. So if country XYZ allows a Russian bank to set up a branch to finance their trade, they are subject to secondary sanctions, which obviously means getting cut away from the US dollar system. Even if the Russian bank isn't sanctioned, if they set up shop in your country, it's a no-go. Any company that deals with them will also get punished. So the US is really tightening the screws on Russia's trade with the world. Firstly, the US can't stop the flow of Russian oil to the markets. It should be obvious that the sanctions have failed and the price cap hasn't worked to bring revenue down. Russia has been selling a ton of their oil at market price minus a small discount. Even those are being soaked up by Russian ships and vessels, so tax revenue for Moscow isn't really affected. According to the CREA, even if the price caps are fully enforced, oil revenues will drop only by 10% at the very most. That won't stop the Russian war machine. Sure, you can set the price cap lower at $30, but that will spike oil prices higher, especially for the West. Then the global recession would really come. You might lower their revenues by another 10%, but the price of crude would spike and decimate industries outside of India and China. So the only option left is to restrict critical imports into Russia. And this is the latest attempt by the US Treasury to make it happen. The issue with this is that transactions don't even need to involve a physical Russian bank branch. This is simply a whack-a-mole game the West is playing with Moscow. The main flow of trade to Russia is still from, shocker, China. In dollars, this reached a record $240 billion last year. China imports a ton of oil from Putin, but more importantly, critical exports are flowing out from Beijing to Russia. And that's only possible because Chinese banks are facilitating the trades, and there's no way to stop them. Firstly, Chinese banks are the biggest financial entities in the world. If you sanction them, you'll just destroy the global financial system in one fell swoop. ICBC Bank, China Construction, ABC, and Bank of China. These banks hold more assets than either JP Morgan or Bank of America. The US can't afford to block these entities from SWIFT or cut them away from the dollar system. It will just grind global trade to a halt. It will force countries to de-dollarize and trade in the Chinese RMB instead. So it's just counterproductive. It will cause a bigger crisis than Lehman Brothers, and it's even bigger than seizing Russia's frozen assets. So this is a red line even for the US Treasury. Countries that want to trade with Russia can always use Chinese institutions to get the job done. Now, China, of course, doesn't want to tempt Washington either, so they are moving all these transactions with Russia to their smaller banks. Researchers in China agree that the solution is very simple. Just use smaller banks to resolve the threat of secondary sanctions. So all the small little banks on the border regions, they can be financing channels to settle trade. And there are around 4,000 small Chinese banks and many of them are already consolidating. They're going to disappear eventually. So using them to facilitate trade with Russia is perfect. They're going to get shut down sooner or later, just too many banks out there in China anyway. So we'll continue to see more exporters from China move their business there. These banks don't deal in business with the US and they mainly use RMB as their main currency. So US sanctions will just roll off them. The biggest threat to the US isn't the Chinese banks or the Russian banks. Frankly, banks they are becoming archaic institutions because trade will be going digital. Why would you risk the US tracing your transactions, right? You might as well use the blockchain and turn everything into one big black box. And that is what China is planning. Two simultaneous things are happening in the world that we can't ignore. Firstly, Hong Kong has launched the digital RMB payments pilot. It's the first outside of mainland China. So people and merchants can start buying and selling things using China's digital currency. It's a closed ledger system, so no third party will know who bought what or who sold what. The second development is, of course, the M-Bridge system involving China and the BRICS countries. And this involves commercial banks trading amongst themselves. Countries like the UAE, Thailand, and Saudi Arabia are already on board. So countries looking to trade with Russia can actually use China as the intermediary without oversight. Trade financing is among the biggest planned users. Commercial banks can make large transfers and FX deals between each other, and it makes sense. This is going to be the future of trade, especially amongst the global south. So the US Treasury's move to ban Russian bank branches is quite bizarre. Outside of China, I don't even think any country even wants more bank branches from Russia. It's a 1980s strategy when we are in 2024. Once the digital RMB and the M-Bridge rolls out, a ton of trade involving Russia will just migrate there. So it's really a futile exercise to close whatever loopholes the US perceives there are, right? The US should in fact, if I was the US to counter this, I'll create my own digital dollar to lock countries into the ecosystem, but that also isn't happening. We are seeing a desperate scramble on both the financial and diplomatic fronts. Sullivan's trip to Beijing once again really doesn't move the needle. But as always, let me know what you think, guys. Did Sullivan accomplish anything on his trip? And will countries halt trade with Russia for the US? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.